Dave had just turned 18, and he was ready to embark on a new chapter of his life. The looming freedom of university awaited him, promising a future of independence, new friendships, and the thrill of being on his own for the first time. But while excitement grew for the life ahead, there was an unshakable restlessness within him, a feeling he couldn't quite place. Life at home had changed significantly over the past year, and the source of that change was unmistakable. His father's new wife, Julia, John, Dave's father, was now 44, and he'd been a single parent for most of Dave's teenage years. Their bond was a strong but quiet one, built on understanding and shared routines rather than emotional conversations. They were comfortable in their silence, both used to the predictability of each other's presence. That all changed when Julia entered their lives. Julia was young, only 28, and with her arrival, she brought an energy that was as refreshing as it was unsettling. She was the opposite of his father in almost every way. Where John was reserved, practical, and often worn down by work, Julia was lively, spontaneous, and seemed to find joy in the smallest things. With her infectious laughter and warm smile, she lit up every room she entered, effortlessly drawing people in. She didn't just enter a room. She filled it with her presence, her laugh, and the way her eyes sparkled when she spoke. At first, Dave saw her simply as his dad's new wife, another adult in the household he had to adjust to. He wasn't thrilled about having a new family member, and he kept his distance, watching Julia carefully, unsure of how she'd fit into their world. But Julia had a way of breaking down walls without even trying. She showed a genuine interest in him, asking about his plans, listening when he spoke about his goals for university, and encouraging him in a way that felt both motherly and friendly. It was strange and unfamiliar, but comforting in a way he hadn't expected. One warm evening in late June, Dave experienced a shift in how he saw her. He came into the kitchen, expecting to see Julia busy with dinner preparations, but he was met with a sight that caught him completely off guard. She stood by the window, the soft glow of the sunset framing her in warm, golden light as she hummed to herself, her eyes distant, lost in thought. She looked so serene, so effortlessly beautiful in that moment, that Dave found himself frozen, unable to look away. He felt a strange flutter in his chest, an involuntary reaction he hadn't felt before. He quickly shook off the thought, feeling a mix of embarrassment and confusion. "This is ridiculous," he muttered to himself. She was his stepmother, his father's wife. These thoughts were wrong. He forced himself to look away, pretending to be busy with something on the kitchen counter, but the feeling lingered, gnawing at him even as he tried to dismiss it. In the days that followed, Dave found himself thinking about Julia more often than he cared to admit. Her laughter, her smile, the way she'd tilt her head when she was listening intently, it all replayed in his mind like a broken record. He began noticing small things about her that he'd overlooked before. The faint freckles on her nose, the way she'd run her fingers through her hair absent-mindedly, and the soft way she'd call his name when she needed his help with something around the house. He began lingering around her, finding excuses to spend time in the same room. If she was in the living room reading, he'd pretend to need something from the bookshelf nearby. If she was cooking, he'd offer to help, even if it was just chopping vegetables or washing dishes. Each small interaction fed a curiosity he knew was dangerous, but he couldn't resist. He told himself it was harmless, that it didn't mean anything, but deep down, he knew he was lying to himself. One evening, he found himself sitting alone on the back porch, watching the sun set over the trees. The sky was painted in shades of pink and orange, the warm light fading slowly into the cool blue of twilight. He heard the soft click of the door behind him and turned to see Julia stepping outside, carrying 2 glasses of iced tea. She smiled as she handed him one and settled next to him on the bench, close enough that he could feel her warmth. For a while, they sat in comfortable silence, each lost in their own thoughts as they watched the fading colors of the sunset. Then, breaking the quiet, Julia spoke, her voice soft and reflective. "It's beautiful, isn't it?" she murmured, her gaze fixed on the horizon. Dave nodded, his heart racing as he stole a quick glance at her. In the soft glow of twilight, Julia looked almost ethereal, her features softened by the fading light. He felt the same strange flutter in his chest, stronger now, and tried to ignore it, taking a long sip of his drink to steady himself. They began to talk about life, about his plans for university, about little memories she shared from her own youth. Her words painted vivid pictures of her past, each story pulling him in further, making him feel closer to her than he ever had. She laughed easily, sharing moments of vulnerability that made him feel like they were the only two people in the world. At one point, their hands brushed, a small, accidental touch that sent a shock through him. For a brief moment, her hand lingered on his, and he felt an urge to hold on to it, to see if she felt the same electricity he did. But before he could react, she pulled her hand away, a slight blush coloring her cheeks as she looked away. As they got up to head back inside, Julia paused at the door, her gaze lingering on him. There was something in her eyes, an unspoken understanding, a silent acknowledgement of the connection between them that neither dared to speak of. She smiled softly, whispering, "Good night, Dave," before disappearing into the house, leaving him standing alone, his mind racing. That night, Dave lay awake, replaying the evening in his mind over and over. He felt exhilarated, terrified, and deeply confused. The line between admiration and attraction had blurred, and he knew he was treading on dangerous ground. Yet, despite the guilt, he couldn't deny the excitement, the thrill of being close to her, of feeling seen in a way he hadn't felt before. As he stared at the ceiling, he realized the simple, innocent curiosity he'd felt at the beginning had transformed into something much deeper, something he didn't understand and couldn't control. The feelings lingered, filling him with both dread and a forbidden sense of longing that he knew would not easily fade. In the days following that evening on the porch, Dave's feelings for Julia only intensified. Every moment around her felt charged with tension he tried, and failed, to ignore. His once simple admiration for her had transformed into something deeper, something he didn't fully understand but couldn't escape. He found himself watching her, observing every detail, every expression, as though his mind was documenting her presence, unable to look away. One afternoon, while his father was at work, Dave entered the kitchen to find Julia cooking. The rich smell of spices filled the room, and she was focused on chopping vegetables, humming softly to herself. Her hair was pulled back, a few loose strands framing her face. Dave felt his chest tighten, and he lingered in the doorway, not wanting to interrupt. Julia glanced up, catching his gaze, and smiled. "Hey, Dave, want to help out?" she asked, handing him a knife. The gesture felt natural, as if they'd done this 100 times before, and Dave stepped forward, taking his place beside her. They worked side by side, the rhythm of chopping and stirring filling the silence. Occasionally, their hands would brush or they'd exchange a quick, almost shy smile. Dave couldn't remember the last time he'd felt so at ease and yet so intensely aware of someone's presence. Her laughter filled the room when he made a clumsy joke about his cooking skills, and he felt an unbidden warmth spread through him. As they prepared the meal, Julia began to talk about her life before she'd met his father. She shared stories from her college days, tales of road trips with friends, and moments of wild spontaneity that left him both amused and intrigued. Her stories made her seem more than just his stepmother. She was a real person, with dreams, regrets, and a past he'd never thought to ask about. Dave found himself sharing more about his own life, too. He spoke about his dreams for university, his fears about moving away, and the uncertainty of leaving everything he knew behind. Julia listened with genuine interest, nodding and offering encouragement. She made him feel understood, seen in a way that left him both comforted and exposed. They were interrupted by the loud ring of her phone, breaking the quiet intimacy of the moment. Julia glanced at the screen, then sighed as she answered. It was John, calling to say he'd be home late. As she spoke, Dave caught himself feeling a pang of relief, and a twinge of guilt followed it. The realization that he was happy to have her to himself, even if just for a few more hours, was both exhilarating and terrifying. After dinner, they moved to the living room, where Julia suggested they watch a movie. Dave knew it was an innocent invitation, but the thrill of being alone with her, in the soft light of the dimmed room, was intoxicating. They sat close, The only sounds the quiet dialogue from the screen and their own steady breathing. Occasionally, Julia would laugh softly at a joke, and Dave would feel himself relax, caught up in the moment. About halfway through the movie, Julia turned to him with a soft smile, her expression relaxed. "I'm glad we can spend some time together like this, Dave," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I feel like I don't get to know you as well as I'd like." Dave's heart raced. Her words felt heavy with unspoken meaning, hinting at a closeness he had longed for but didn't dare expect. Unable to resist any longer, he looked into her eyes, searching for any sign, anything that might reveal if she felt the same spark. "Me too," he replied, his voice unsteady. You're different from anyone I've ever known." Their eyes met, and in the dim light, it felt as if the world had faded away, leaving only the two of them in that suspended moment. Dave's heart pounded, his pulse loud in his ears as he leaned forward, inching closer. His hand reached toward hers, their fingers just barely touching when Julia gently placed a hand on his shoulder, stopping him. "Dave, we can't do this," she whispered, her voice soft but firm, filled with a mix of regret and sympathy. Her eyes were filled with both sadness and understanding, as if she, too, had felt the pull between them but knew it was a line they could never cross. "You're young, and I'm married to your father. This isn't right." Her words hit him like a cold wave, the weight of reality crashing down on him. Shame and confusion flooded over him, and he quickly pulled back, his cheeks burning. He mumbled an apology, unable to meet her gaze, and excused himself from the room, retreating to his bedroom where he could finally let himself breathe. That night, as he lay in bed, he felt the heavy weight of his actions pressing down on him. He knew he had crossed a line he could never uncross, jeopardizing not only his own peace of mind, but also his relationship with Julia and his father. The guilt gnawed at him, but somewhere beneath the shame, he couldn't shake the lingering thrill, the forbidden excitement that he'd felt in that fleeting moment. As he stared at the ceiling, Dave realized his feelings were a tangled mess of attraction, admiration, and confusion. They were feelings he didn't fully understand and didn't know how to control. But one thing was clear: things could never go back to the way they were. Over the next few days, the atmosphere in the house grew thick with tension. Both Dave and Julia acted as though nothing had happened, but the memory of that moment between them lingered, hovering over every conversation, every shared space. The light-hearted interactions they once had felt strained, burdened by the weight of what hadn't been said. Dave's guilt twisted in his chest, but even as he told himself to move on, the memory of Julia's gaze, her touch, kept pulling him back. John returned from his business trip, oblivious to the shift between them, though he quickly sensed something was off. He noticed the silence between Dave and Julia, the way they seemed to avoid being alone together, the way their eyes never quite met. He watched them both with quiet suspicion, but he said nothing, observing instead, waiting for a clue to explain the tension. One evening, while the three of them sat at the dinner table, John finally broke the silence. He put down his fork and looked at them both, his expression thoughtful but serious. "Is everything all right with you two?" he asked, his voice calm but sharp. "You both seem different lately." Dave's heart skipped a beat, his stomach nodding as he glanced up at his father. Across the table, Julia forced a tight smile. "Of course, John. Just busy, I suppose," she said, casting a quick glance at Dave before returning her gaze to her plate. But her attempt at casualness only seemed to deepen John's suspicion. John's eyes lingered on them, his expression unreadable. "You know, I'm not blind. I notice things," he added, his tone dropping. Dave felt the blood drain from his face as his father's words sank in. Was it possible that John knew something? Had he sensed the connection between them? In the following days, John's quiet concern evolved into distrust. He became watchful, his gaze sharp and calculating whenever he was around them. Dave felt his father's eyes on him constantly, and the pressure began to mount. The walls seemed to close in with each passing day, and every interaction felt like a test of his composure. One night, Dave was lying in bed, exhausted but unable to sleep. The house was quiet, the only sound the soft murmur of voices from the kitchen downstairs. Curiosity got the better of him, and he quietly slipped out of his room, creeping down the stairs until he could hear the conversation more clearly. He recognized his father's voice, low and tense. "Don't treat me like a fool, Julia," John was saying, his tone edged with bitterness. "I've seen the way you two act around each other. Do you think I haven't noticed?" Dave froze, his heart pounding in his chest. He held his breath, listening as Julia responded, her voice calm but strained. "John, you're overreacting. Dave is just a kid, and I'm your wife. This is all in your head." John's laugh was cold and bitter. "In my head? Maybe I've been gone too much, but I'm not blind." There was a pause, and Dave could only imagine the tension that filled the silence between them. Unable to bear it any longer, Dave stepped back, retreating up the stairs as quietly as he could, his mind racing. His father knew, or at least, he sensed that something was wrong. The full weight of the situation pressed down on him, and for the first time, Dave realized just how close they were to losing everything. The guilt he'd felt before multiplied, twisting in his stomach as he lay awake, staring at the ceiling, the realization sinking in. Their fragile family balance was on the verge of shattering, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. He had crossed a line he could never uncross, and the consequences were now beyond his control. The days that followed were filled with a thick, almost suffocating tension. Dave felt as if he were walking on glass, his every movement, his every word carefully measured. John's suspicion was now palpable, and his normally calm demeanor had shifted into something colder, more watchful. Julia, too, was affected, her usual warmth replaced by a visible strain. She avoided being alone with Dave, her smiles forced, her laughter missing its usual spark. One evening, as they all sat down to dinner, the silence was unbearable. The clinking of silverware against plates was the only sound in the room, each bite taken in forced calm. John looked up, his gaze fixed on Dave, his expression unreadable. Finally, he spoke, his voice quiet but sharp. "Dave, is there something you'd like to tell me?" His words cut through the silence, catching both Dave and Julia off guard. Dave felt his heart race, his mouth going dry as he struggled to find words. "No, Dad," he replied, his voice barely above a whisper. There's nothing." John continued to study him, his eyes narrowing. "You sure? Because I've been noticing things lately, things that don't add up." Dave glanced at Julia, who was staring down at her plate, her face pale. She looked up briefly, meeting John's gaze with a mixture of defiance and fear. "John, don't," she said softly, her voice shaking slightly. "This isn't the time." John's eyes hardened. "Then when, Julia? When is the time? I've been watching the two of you. Your silence, the way you avoid each other. Something isn't right, and I won't ignore it." Dave could feel the walls closing in around him, his mind racing as he searched for a way out. The fear in Julia's eyes only added to his desperation, a silent plea that he didn't know how to answer. Unable to take the pressure any longer, Dave pushed his chair back, standing up abruptly. "I'm sorry," he whispered, his voice cracking. I think I need some air." Without waiting for a response, he turned and hurried out of the room, his heart pounding as he stepped into the cool night air. Outside, he took deep breaths, trying to calm the storm inside him. But the weight of his father's accusation, the cold realization that everything he had tried to hide was now laid bare, made it impossible to find peace. His mind was a whirlwind of regret, fear, and the haunting echo of his father's words. Just as he was beginning to collect himself, the door opened behind him, and he turned to see Julia stepping out, her expression troubled. She walked over, wrapping her arms around herself as she looked at him. "Dave," she began, her voice soft, barely audible. "I'm so sorry. I never meant for any of this to happen." Dave shook his head, his own guilt rising. "It's my fault, Julia. I should have kept my distance. I should have stopped myself." He looked away, unable to meet her gaze. "I've ruined everything." Julia reached out, placing a gentle hand on his shoulder, and he felt a surge of emotion that he struggled to contain. "You're not alone in this, Dave," she whispered, her voice filled with sadness. I I didn't handle things the way I should have, but we can't change the past." They stood there in silence, the weight of their choices pressing down on them, until finally, Julia pulled her hand away, stepping back. "We need to face this, Dave. Whatever happens, we need to be honest with him." Dave nodded, though fear gnawed at him. The thought of facing his father's anger almost too much to bear. But he knew Julia was right. There was no escaping the truth. They re-entered the house, the tension thick as they prepared for the conversation that would change everything. As they stepped back inside, Dave and Julia found John waiting for them in the living room. His face was pale, his jaw clenched, and his eyes burned with a cold intensity that made Dave's stomach twist. He had never seen his father like this, a mix of betrayal, rage, and heartbreak all blending together. John gestured for them to sit down, and they did so hesitantly, exchanging quick, nervous glances. The silence in the room was oppressive, each second stretching longer than the last, until finally, John spoke. "I want the truth," he said, his voice low and unsteady. "I deserve that much, don't you think?" Dave felt his throat tighten, every word he had rehearsed in his mind suddenly slipping away. He looked at Julia, who nodded, her expression filled with resolve and sadness. John's gaze shifted from Julia to Dave, his eyes narrowing. "I've seen the way you look at her, Dave. And Julia, I trusted you. I trusted you to be a part of this family." His voice cracked slightly, betraying the pain behind his anger. "I thought this was in my head, but I can't keep lying to myself." Julia took a deep breath, her hands trembling slightly as she looked at John. "John, please understand," she began, her voice soft but steady. "Nothing happened. I should have seen how things were affecting him. Maybe I was too friendly, maybe I wasn't careful enough with my actions, but it wasn't intentional." John shook his head, his face etched with disbelief. "Not intentional," he repeated, his tone harsh. "So it's just a coincidence that my son and my wife can barely look each other in the eye?" Unable to stay silent any longer, Dave finally spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. "Dad, it's my fault. I started to feel things I shouldn't have. I tried to fight it. I tried to ignore it. But I couldn't. Julia didn't do anything wrong. She's been kind to me, that's all." John's face twisted with pain, his hands balling into fists. "You're telling me my own son feels this way about my wife?" His voice shook, each word filled with disbelief. "After everything we've been through, after everything I've done for you?" Dave's shame overwhelmed him, and he lowered his gaze, unable to meet his father's eyes. "I'm sorry, Dad," he whispered, his voice breaking. "I never meant for any of this to happen. I didn't want to hurt you." But John's gaze remained unyielding, his expression cold. "I don't care about your excuses, Dave. You've betrayed me. Both of you have. This family. I thought it meant something to you." He looked at Julia, his face etched with raw betrayal. "I trusted you, Julia. I believed in us." Julia's eyes filled with tears, her voice trembling as she spoke. "John, I'm so sorry. I never wanted this to happen. I love you. But I should have handled things better. I should have seen what was happening." John took a shaky breath, his eyes filled with a sadness that Dave had never seen before. "I want you out of this house, Dave," he said finally, his tone cold and resolute. "I can't look at you right now. I don't even know who you are." Dave felt the words hit him like a physical blow, the weight of his father's rejection pressing down on him. He looked at Julia, who was wiping away tears, her expression filled with regret and sorrow. He wanted to say something, to explain himself, to beg for forgiveness, but he knew there was nothing left to say. Without another word, Dave stood up and walked to the door, feeling as though the walls of the house were closing in around him. The life he had known was slipping away, each step taking him further from the family he had just lost. As he stepped outside, the cool night air hit him, and he felt a hollow ache settle in his chest. His phone buzzed in his pocket, pulling him from his thoughts. He looked at the screen, surprised to see a message from an unknown number. Opening it, his heart sank as he realized it was a video, footage from a hidden camera inside the house. Subscribe so you don't miss new stories on the channel.